Trial records from the 1692 Salem Witch Trials do not survive. The official record book of the court of Oyer and Terminer, the court that condemned the people who were hanged, no longer exists. We have close to 1,000 pages of original 1692 paperwork, but the first 27 trials themselves, the proceedings that sent 19 people to the gallows and condemned 8 more, left almost no readable trace. I'm Josh Hutchinson. Welcome to the Thing About the Salem Witch Trials.
I'm Sarah Jack. Where do the facts about the Salem Witch Trials come from? From several places. We do have the record book for the trials held by the Superior Court in 1693, but for what happened in 1692, we turn to arrest warrants, examinations, jailers' bills, depositions, diaries, and a handful of published accounts, most of it organized only in the last 20 years. Today, we are talking about what did survive, what was lost, the decade-long project that made the surviving records usable, the myths those records overturn, and how Salem compares to the other New England colonies when it comes to records.
What people call the Salem trial records are almost all pretrial documents. They are examinations, preliminary hearings, not trials. 2 magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, ran most of the examinations, and they only decided whether there was enough evidence to jail the accused until a grand jury could take the case. When the examination and arrest began, the new royal charter had not reached Massachusetts, and the Reformed General Court had not yet begun its first session.
While John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin are well known for leading the initial Salem interrogations, several other high-ranking officials and judges also stepped in to participate in specific preliminary examinations.
For example, in April 1692, Deputy Governor Thomas Danforth presided over a special council examination of Sarah Cloyce and Elizabeth Proctor at the Salem Meeting House, accompanied by 4 members of the Governor's Council: Samuel Sewall, James Russell, Isaac Addington, and Samuel Appleton.
The following month, William Stoughton and Samuel Sewall joined John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin at Ingersoll's Tavern to examine the former Salem village minister, George Burroughs. We also see other notable leaders participating, such as Bartholomew Gedney, who examined an enslaved woman named Candy, alongside Judge Hathorne in July, and John Higginson Jr., who accompanied Judge Hathorne and Corwin straight to the prison keeper's house to question 4-year-old Dorothy Good. John Hale, minister for the town of Beverly, also privately questioned Ann Foster. Hathorne questioned people as if they were already guilty. He would ask, "Why do you hurt these children?"
The accusers were in the room, and scribes like Ezekiel Cheever and Reverend Samuel Parris took the exchanges down as dialogue. That is why the examinations read like drama and get mistaken for trials.
Actual trial records documented the formal court process, the grand jury's decision on each indictment, the arraignment, the plea, the seating of a trial jury, sworn testimony, the verdict, and either the sentence or a note about the release of the prisoner.
The prosecution was led by the Attorney General. First that was Thomas Newton, and then later was Anthony Checkley. William Stoughton presided over the court as Chief Justice. We do have one direct trace of how the trials ran. The sworn depositions collected before trial were carried back into the courtroom and read, and the clerks noted that the deponents affirmed, or in their language owned, their testimony in front of the jurors. That notation is one of the only records of trial procedure that we still have.
The lost record book would be terse and procedural, far less vivid than the examinations. Trial records of this period set a case down as the indictment, the plea, the jury, the verdict, and the sentence, a few lines each, with no transcript of what was actually said.
We do have a comparison. The Superior Court records from the 1693 proceedings did survive, and they show that same spare character: indictments, jury actions, verdicts, and little else. The 1692 book most likely looked much the same.
So much of what we know comes from observers who published their own accounts, and they did not agree with each other. Cotton Mather wrote Wonders of the Invisible World as the sole authorized defense of the court, commissioned by Governor Phipps to justify what the judges had done.
Robert Calef answered him in More Wonders of the Invisible World, publishing the Andover confessors' own recantation, in which they said their confessions were false and had been forced out of them. And Thomas Brattle, a Boston merchant, wrote a letter in October 1692 tearing the evidence apart, mocking the idea that you could catch a witch through spectral evidence, and calling the touch test Salem superstition.
Reverend John Hale supported the trials in 1692, then reversed himself in 1697 in his book, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft. He admitted they had run on misguided fear, writing that, quote, "Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of former precedents, that we walked in the clouds and could not see our way." Increase Mather, Cotton's father, argued in Cases of Conscience that the devil could take the shape of an innocent person, which undercut spectral evidence, and he wrote that it was better for 10 witches to escape than for one innocent person to be condemned.
Deodat Lawson, a former Salem village minister, rushed a first-hand account into print within weeks of the first afflictions, a brief and true narrative describing the fits he saw and the bite marks he said appeared on the afflicted. And Thomas Maule, a Quaker, took it somewhere else entirely in his 1695 book, Truth Held Forth and Maintained, arguing the trials were not a satanic plot, but God's judgment on New England for its earlier persecution of Quakers. He portrayed the men doing the prosecuting as the ones who were actually in league with the devil.
We can still prove the official records existed. Even though the book is missing, on June 2, 1692, Stephen Sewall was sworn in as clerk of the court in open session, with an oath to certify the accuracy of the court's documents. A sworn clerk of a court of record is, by definition, keeping a record.
And Cotton Mather wrote just 5 detailed trial narratives in Wonders of the Invisible World. He wrote about Bridget Bishop, George Burroughs, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Martha Carrier, working directly from Sewall's official materials with Sewall's and Stoughton's cooperation. Mather was reading real records to do that. We just don't have them except through his account.
In 1688, 4 years before Salem, an Irish widow named Goody Glover was hanged as a witch in Boston. Cotton Mather told the whole story in his book, Memorable Providences, but no official court records of that trial survives.
Mather gives the year 1688, and from the dates around it, you can tell the hanging fell in November. But he never records the exact day. For that, the only source is the Judge Samuel Sewall's private diary, in which he described the procession leading Goody Glover to the gallows passing by as he watched. On November 16th, he wrote, "The widow Glover is drawn by to be hanged. Mr. Larkin seems to be marshal, the constables attend, and Justice Bullivant there." Without that one line, we would not know the date that Goody Glover died.
That same diary carries the Salem executions in a few lines each. Sewall recorded that in August, when the 5 people were hanged, Cotton Mather assured the crowd they all died by a righteous sentence.
In September, he recorded that Giles Corey was pressed to death for standing mute, because Corey refused to answer his indictment, and under the law, a man who would not answer could not be tried. The same diary is also where we get the information on the heat that was experienced on the hanging days.
As for where the Salem records went, Margot Burns points to the possibility of the Stamp Act protests of the 1760s. Governor Thomas Hutchinson had gathered a large collection of original Salem documents at his house to copy for a history he was writing. Hutchinson's book, The History of the Province of Massachusetts Bay, did in fact include many transcripts of original handwritten records which no longer exist.
When a mob ransacked the house, the papers were thrown into the street, and fragments of the Carrier boys' interrogations were destroyed. We cannot prove the record book was in that collection, but it is the likeliest place for it to have been, and the collection was scattered and destroyed that night.
That was not the only loss, and the gaps are uneven. The original interrogation transcript of Abigail Hobbs disappeared over the years. We only have it because someone made photostat copies in the early 1900s, and those were preserved.
Margaret Scott was hanged in September 1692 and survives in only a few papers, mostly indictments and depositions. The later examinations up in Andover were written down as short summaries instead of word-for-word transcriptions.
The records we have are only as good as who was holding the pen when they were observing what was happening. the same hour in the same room could come down to us as near verbatim. The story we get and how it is told really comes down to who the scribe was.
In Salem Village, Samuel Parris tried to catch every word, but he was a heavily biased scribe, being the father and uncle of two afflicted persons. He definitely had skin on one side of the game, and so you have to take everything that he wrote with a grain of salt. But he did try to write everything down accurately. In Andover, the clerks summarized, and there are no surviving minister papers from the Andover leaders and very few formal complaints for the accused. So whose voice survives and how fully was decided by whoever was writing it down.
But some Andover voices came through clearly, and they came from the confessors themselves. Mary Osgood, the wife of a prominent Andover man, confessed in the autumn of 1692 to signing the Devil's Book.
She's my 11th great-grandmother, and that October she recanted in front of Increase Mather, saying the confession was wholly false, and that she had been brought to it by the violent urging and unreasonable pressings used against her. She was not alone. A group of Andover women who had confessed retracted together, saying they had been overwhelmed into it. Those recantations survive, and they are part of how we know the confessions were coerced. When Osgood was finally tried in that surviving 1693 court, she pleaded not guilty and was acquitted.
This diverse collection of records that we've been discussing is what every historian is working with when they are developing a Salem Witch Trials book.
And the resource that finally pulled all of these disparate records together is a book published in 2009 called Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt, which you need to buy. And it collected the roughly 980 surviving legal documents, corrected the transcripts, and put all the records in chronological order. Putting them in sequence lets people read the crisis day by day and watch how it built up instead of jumping between undated fragments.
The project started because the general editor, Bernard Rosenthal, found a typo in a transcript. An older transcription dated Tituba's grand jury to 1692, when it was 1693. He decided the existing transcriptions could not be trusted and set out to fix it, thinking it would take 2 or 3 years.
It ended up taking a team of 12 people 10 years. Rosenthal led it as general editor, Margot Burns was associate editor and project manager, and they brought in linguists like Matty Piccola and Peter Grund specifically for the handwriting.
The handwriting was central to the work. They analyzed more than 200 different hands to identify who wrote each document, which tells you who was present in shaping the record.
They pulled original manuscripts from 12 archives, mainly the Peabody Essex Museum and the Massachusetts State Archives, and worked with these records in person. Every document was first transcribed by a 2-person team, then reviewed repeatedly by different pairs of eyes. They even printed 3 documents that had nothing to do with the Salem Witch Trials in order to explain why those did not belong.
They also caught what earlier editions had missed. The 1930s transcripts behind the older Salem witchcraft papers left out notes and dockets written on the backs of the pages because the transcribers never turned the sheets over.
That is the difference between the older versions and the 2009 edition. One of them went back to the manuscripts and read both sides. There is a myth that the book cannot count as a primary source because you're reading a transcription instead of the original handwriting, but each document was transcribed directly from the manuscript and checked by many readers against both sides of the page.
Getting their records right also settles a myth that people who confessed at Salem were never tried or executed.
The records disprove that. Samuel Wardwell confessed, then took his confession back, and he was still indicted, convicted, and hanged. And other confessors were also tried and condemned in September 1692 and January 1693. The paperwork is why we can say that with certainty instead of repeating the legend.
Salem is only part of the picture. The other New England colonies left their own records, and some are older. Connecticut was prosecuting witchcraft decades before 1692, and it had made witchcraft a capital crime in 1642.
There's an indictment from 1651 against a Wethersfield carpenter named John Carrington. It charges that, not having the fear of God before thine eyes, thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan, the great enemy of God and mankind. And it ends by pronouncing that thou deservest to die. John Carrington and his wife Joan were both hanged at Hartford that year, the first married couple executed as witches in New England.
Connecticut also produced one of the biggest myths about these records. For over a century, people claimed the colony either never held real witch trials or destroyed the records out of embarrassment. As late as 1908, historians were still saying the lack of documentation proved that there was nothing there.
But the documents were never destroyed. The Willis family had kept many of the colonial witchcraft depositions in their private home in Hartford since the 1600s and passed them down to relatives out of state. They were private, not gone, so people assumed they did not exist.
Today, those papers are split between the Connecticut State Library in Hartford and Brown University's John Hale Library, where they landed after a descendant sold them off in the 1860s. Both have digitized their portions, so depositions that sat in a private house for 2 centuries are now online for you to read.
And this is not only an American problem. A missing or bad record can define an event for centuries. In Scotland, the 1697 Paisley Witch Trials were fixed in the public mind for 300 years by one sensationalized pamphlet, later turned into a book, that claimed 2 boys, aged 11 and 14, were the ringleaders of a witch coven.
Every popular retelling after that, plays, songs, and articles leaned on that one account. It was only in the last few years that historians found the actual trial notes and learned the accused were not 2 boys at all. They were grown men who worked as tenant farmers.
Back in New England, the surviving records go well beyond court files. Diaries fill real gaps. John Winthrop's journal recorded the early executions of Margaret Jones and Alice Young, and we only know the date Alice Young was hanged because a Windsor town clerk, Matthew Grant, noted it on the flyleaf of a book.
There are defamation suits filed by people who sued neighbors for calling them witches, like Mary Staples in Connecticut and Jane Walford in New Hampshire. There are petitions, too, like William Morris's letter defending his wife Elizabeth in 1681.
There are administrative records like a mitimus, a jail transfer order, for Mary Black, an enslaved woman accused at Salem. And there are everyday sources, vital records, probate files, deeds, and church records of confessions, excommunications, and even meeting house seating, which historians use to map the disputes behind the accusations.
Some of the surviving material is very practical. We have itemized blacksmith bills for the chains and shackles, and jailers' accounts, like John Arnold's in Boston, recording when each prisoner arrived, when they left, and what their food cost, which is how we know who died in custody. There are also officers' returns, the notes a constable wrote on the back of an arrest warrant to confirm he had made the arrest.
And the most important record in these cases is one we do not have, because it never existed. The accusations come back again and again and again and again.
And again.
And again. And again to the Devil's Book, the register the accused were said to have signed to seal a covenant with the devil.
At one point, they were close to discovering it, but a black cat jumped out. That's in the records. Confessors described the Devil's Book. The afflicted claimed they were being pushed to sign it. Many confessions centered on the Devil's Book, but it was never produced.
And they almost got it in the case of Mercy Short because she pointed out where she had seen it, and a man went over to get it, but he was scared by a cat jumping out at him, like Sarah said.
Because they were going to produce it for Governor Phipps. That's amazing.
That would have been amazing if they could have brought in a Devil's Book of some kind. But alas, it was never entered into evidence, never laid in front of the court, never seen by anyone except for these afflicted people claiming that they saw it, because it was not a real document. It existed only in testimony. We have the itemized bill for the shackles, but the record that the entire case rested on was the one that could never be produced.
Some of the records come directly from the accused. John Alden, a prominent Bostonian, was held for 15 weeks. and he wrote up his own examination describing how they afflicted played juggling tricks. We have it because Robert Calef printed it.
And Sarah and I are both descendants of Mary Esty. After she was condemned, she petitioned the court, not asking for her own life. She asked that no more innocent blood be shed, meaning the people who would be accused after her. The original petition still exists, and it was recently on display at the Peabody Essex Museum.
This is why records matter. They are what let us give the accused their names, their voices, their life stories back.
Mary Esty asked that no more innocent blood be shed, and honoring that means using the records we do have to say plainly who these people were and that they were totally innocent.
If you want to see any of this for yourself, the Salem transcriptions are collected in the book Records of the Salem Witch-Hunt, and the Peabody Essex Museum has put high-quality images of hundreds of Salem originals online.
For Connecticut, the Willis depositions are digitized through the Connecticut State Library and Brown University, and we'll have links to those in the show notes. And you can find the books that we rely on through our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/indwitchhunts.